I'm director of Oaks Research Center, and we have been monitoring and analyzing the media through the lens of gender for almost over 2 decades now. And so this report is also based on that, and I'll let my colleague Ahmed talk more about that because I'm a little unwell, but I like to just give a brief background of this report that as soon as COVID-19 hit the world, we in Pakistan also started to my organization started to look at the media through the lens of gender and how it was being reported in Pakistani newspapers and electronic media. And that's when the idea of compiling the data and putting it together in a report form came to my mind. And I started to look for some funding, which didn't come through, but we said, all right, we'll just go ahead. It's a lot of hard work put in. We have Shaista from a team who'll tell us about the whole process of monitoring and how many newspapers and how many hours of TV and everything. But it's been a very long process. It's been a very I would say exciting project for us because it kept on being delayed for one reason or the other, and it sort of helped us in the end because we got the encouragement from CWGL. I would like to thank Krishanti and Koset both for their continued support and encouragement to go ahead with the report. And so in the end, we have sort of partnered with them, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be partnering with such an organization for the launch of a report. And the report itself is almost like 9 or 10 months data, 3 months before the COVID, and rest of the months after the COVID started. And it also gave us another area to look into, because prior to this we were just monitoring and analyzing the media on how women were being portrayed. So through this report and from here on, we will be sort of measuring the sort of erasure of women in the media. So there is a whole new process that Ahmed will talk about. And I would again like to welcome everybody, and it's over to you, Ahmed, and then he'll be moderating for me, in my place, because after my COVID, I'm still a little unwell, So over to you, Ahmed.
Thank you so much. I hope everybody can hear me. And if you can't, just let me know so I can talk louder. All right, so we started off thinking that we aren't seeing enough intersectional stories in the pandemic. So what basically that meant was everyone was at home, everyone was in lockdown. From various parts of the world, we were being told that domestic violence is on the increase, but nothing had really emerged in Pakistan inside the media, on television and newspapers, so on and so forth. Nothing for the first month and a half, nothing had really emerged out here. And when we went into the numbers, then we figured out that actually the entire spectrum of reporting on gender, the entire spectrum, not just the violence, not just the harassment, not just the rapes, not just those crimes, but in fact, the successes, the contributions, how women had actually been agents of change, of positive change, how new things had come up through women entrepreneurs, all of those things were also noted. So eventually we had a situation whereby there was only 3 to 4%, give and take a few things, a few numbers. This is an error level that we're kind of allowing. But even if you were to do that, less than 3 to 4% of reportage, of all reportage in Pakistani media was on women. Less than 4%, that is a joke. Less than 4% meant this figure actually also included violence against women. So in a sense, what we had looked at was that the erasure of violence against women, that is where it started. But the erasure just went on and on and on. So that is how the process started. And if you've just been through the report, there are multiple things that are happening in this report, which we just kind of built in and kind of try to understand, taking a distance, try to understand what is happening and how it's happening. The absence of reporting on women, on crimes against women, that was a very crucial concern, because as we kind of figured out, what was being reported in newspapers is not what was being reported in television. If newspapers were telling us that 100 crimes had been committed, television was telling us, well, maybe 2 or 3 crimes have been committed, no biggie. Which led us to this new metric that we defined. We called it the reporting integrity index. The RRI is basically about organizations and journalists and measuring their integrity, whether they have the integrity to report the reported cases. As we all know, reported cases are already very, very low in cybership. Hardly a fraction basically goes ahead in the police. And what the Pakistani media had tried to do was basically hide all of those figures as well. And this became very, very crucial in Ramzan, which is a holy month in the Islamic calendar. And there's a lot of piety and all of that associated bits coming with it. None of the figures against of violence against women, none of that was released through the electronic media. In fact, you see a systematic erasure of all. And that led us to believe that, hang on, this is very, very conscious. This is not just about, well, our organization doesn't have enough reporters. This is not about that. This is not about the fact that this story is newsworthy and this isn't. We all know sexual violence is always newsworthy. So this isn't about that either. This isn't about the fact that figures were not available, because there's a certain way of collating crime figures, of collecting crime figures, of reporting. That process did not happen, because if the number that you're reporting is less than 3 or 4% of what newspapers are actually reporting, then you've not made an effort. You've only made an effort to highlight stories that could create some kind of sensational value for you. You've only made an effort to report stories that will, together, it will rile up people. So there was a case that happened in Pakistan, which was a mother was raped in front of her children on the motor. All the media, all of them, bar none. This was the one story that they all went into. On the same day, there were 8 or 9 other sexual violence stories as well. None of that was important. What they went after was this one story in which they could give this narrative of, oh my God, the children, how about the children? And oh my God, this woman was driving alone. There were these other politics that were being played out in one incident. So there was the CCP, the police chief, he's talking about the fact that this woman is Western. She had had a fight with her husband. Right? So those were the kinds of justifications that we put. Our data will reflect for you that story might have been reported. But at the same time, none of the other stories around that entire period, actually, you don't see other stories being reported. You see the fact that one incident happened and was so big. Oh my God, this is just, by the way, this is just outlier. This is not what happens in Pakistan. That wasn't true. That's not the case. So the reporting integrity index therefore came about. And we discovered that bar 2 newspapers, the others are all taking shortcuts. They are either taking shortcuts, they're not reporting it. And meanwhile, they're gaslighting women by saying, what sexual crimes? What are you talking about? So we kind of went in and we kind of we did that measure. And lo and behold, the very interesting bits is that you have these right-wing elements, these newspapers which are owned by right-wingers. They don't report. Right? They like to portray that Pakistan is free of all of this. But the more disappointing bits were actually the progressive type newspapers who are also not reporting. Dawn, which is the newspaper of record in Pakistan, reports a certain thing. Within Dawn itself, and Dawn also owns a news channel, there's a huge difference between what the newspaper is reporting and between what Dawn, the channel, is reporting, the news channel is reporting. Similarly, the news is a newspaper. It's based out of Karachi as well. What they were reporting is not what their channel was reporting, even though their channel was reporting slightly higher figures than they, as compared to the rest. So the point is that difference of we had a similar last year, I believe. It was about when the media started reporting it. And we had senior men journalists who were telling us that, well, none of this is possible because this is a very, very difficult process. And how do you collate it? Well, it's happening every day. If there is news, which is happening every day, and you have a crime reporter, why is your crime report not doing their job? Why is your editor not doing their job? Why are anchors not doing their job? There are multiple questions that open. But I just kind of also want to now just want to go through this entire story of last year. And I kind of want to focus on the place that was kind of prescribed by these men of the media for women. It's remarkable. So when the pandemic started, we were initially told this is all happening to non-Muslims. It's happening to them, and God is taking some kind of revenge. Then when the pandemic entered our shores, we were told, oh, it's all because our women, because they have strayed from the path of God. So therefore, God has sent his wrath, and God is going to punish us. We had televised duas, public prayers, in which the chap is basically praying to God and saying, God, I have messed up, but look at the women of my nation. You know, they have taken their clothes off. This is literal translation. And who has made them take their clothes off and promote vulgarity and do all of that? When you listen to it as a man, as a progressive man, well, it would enrage you. What had happened in Pakistan was that even progressive men and non-progressive men were listening to that and consuming that hook, line, and sinker and saying, well, yes, that is right. So irrespective of what your social background was, irrespective of how you were thinking, that one moment was very, very instructive for Pakistani media. It was about 90% of them saying, yes, absolutely, you're right. The pandemic is because women have been very, very vulgar. There was only 10% of the media which stood up and said, hang on, what are you talking about? This pandemic is not a gender-based phenomenon. And it's not going to distinguish between who it's targeting and who it's not targeting. Right? But the media were offended at the fact that this Maulana had actually said that because the media is corrupt, our country is in the doldrums. So the media's opposition to the Maulana and his public dua and all of that was not because women were being targeted, it was actually because the media was being targeted. That was the unfortunate part. But in larger terms, that is the role that they had prescribed to women in particular. In talk shows, news reportage, as I've been telling you, less than 4%. So sometimes you'd see one good news item about a woman entrepreneur, for example. you might see a story about a woman policeman, a policewoman who is controlling the mob outside the mosque, which happened in Pakistan. That story went viral for a couple of days. It was good. So you kind of see all of those. You see these little stories sneaking. They're not built in there by design. They're just snuck. They're sneaking. So you see these kind of things popping up, but you still don't see any kind of gender balance. Ux has, for its part, has been basically pushing a gender balance of stories. Sarah Macharya is here. We've been working with Sarah on the Global Media Monitoring Project, which basically deploys a certain kind of framework, which looks at stereotypes, which looks at gender biases in reportage. And we kind of discovered that a lot of our reportage is just about these stereotypes. It's about stereotypes, it's about creating good versus evil, it's about creating this notion of piety and honor and respect, all of which has to do with women. Right? So if you are to control women, then your nationalism is good, then your religion is safe, then everything is in good. But if your women are out of control, oh my God, COVID is never going to stop. So there's a double jeopardy that happened in Pakistan in terms of women. There's this point of erasure, of silencing. Silencing is a very voluntary, right? So there needs to be a certain character there who's doing the silencing. This erasure is even largely because of the fact that there are many people doing the erasing. It's not just one or two who you are targeting and saying, well, you are the problem. Yeah, no, it's an industry-wide phenomenon, and that is very scary actually. And that kind of led us to believe that, hang on, maybe we need to be talking about our activism again and just figuring out how our activism needs to respond to these challenges that the pandemic has kind of reopened. A lot of feminists from our region, they've been struggling for 3, 4, 5, 6 decades. They had managed to get certain rights and certain, create certain norms over the past 5 or 6 decades. And now what you're seeing is this rollback of all of them, in little ways and in large ways. The RRI, therefore, for us is very crucial in these papers who are the foot soldiers of the patriarchy who are doing science. We're not targeting reporters. We're not targeting ordinary journalists. We are saying this organization is doing the science. So that is critical for us. I think that for me should be enough. I would like to bring in Shaista so that she can talk about how much she and the team had to go through just in terms of collecting these news items and just in terms of making sure that, whether we've even registered gender-based things. I mean, the first time when the first set of numbers that came in, and I said, what, 000 for all rape reportage? There's no story there? And Shasta said, yeah, it's weird. So I'm just going to hand over to Shasta, and I think let Shasta talk about the data collections, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you so much, Ahmed Saab. I'll be briefly touching upon these things. The research methodology was mainly content analysis. It was a reportage of 11 newspapers having significant national and regional circulations and was monitored over 12 months. Similarly, 600 hours of 5 main national news channels were also monitored. Strategy for television channels included monitoring of one prime time current affairs show, which was from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. and one prime time news bulletin, which was 9 p.m. to 10 p.m. Data influx from Media Monitor was managed and maintained systematically and categorically in Excel sheets. Media Monitors anchored around gender filters did extensive and comparative monitoring during pre and post-COVID span. pre-pandemic inclusive monitoring focused on violence against women and children. Obviously that was in 2019 from October, November, and December, while holistic and large scale 9 months monitoring was conducted under post-pandemic head. Now themes, obviously these were for about 58 categories which we monitored. But I want to acknowledge my team of monitors, which were total in 11 media monitors, out of which 7 were female and 4 were males. And obviously we do this monitoring on a regular basis, but when we hire someone and it's their new job, we definitely orient them from global media monitoring tools, which help them to monitor the content according to the gender lens. So 58 categories we've monitored. I don't want to name all of them, but obviously some of them were related to gender-based violence, which include abduction, asset crimes, domestic abuse and violence, honor killings, and then it include customary practices as well, like for example, karokari, swara, vani. We also covered violence against children, that was specifically corporal punishment and child sexual abuse. So yes, despite this rigorous monitoring, the sample size remains representative. We have only managed to capture a segment of the media, albeit one that tends to garner the greatest number of eyeballs. And while this is a representative sample, as I have mentioned earlier, that the breadth of the content from multiple sources was poured over by our monitors, so that we find critical insight about the Pakistani mainstream media's treatment of gender-based matters during the pandemic. The third question which you asked me to talk about were intersection recorded as gender or intersectional stories. Yes, we recorded data for this report, as that our concern was the primary and secondary lens deployed in a news story. We were looking for is the number of times women and children were put front and central in news reportage during the COVID-19 crisis. Some stories take topics rather discreetly, like distribution of personal protective equipment for medical professionals. For example, other stories might handle the same topic with more intersectional treatment. The fact that women doctors and nurses were often discriminated against the distribution of PPEs. So we have attempted to capture both kinds of stories. Obviously, it was not enough in the sense that the data collected. So what we tried as a third option, that we were just looking for ordinary women's account during the pandemic. So we collected interviews, focus groups, and through social media. So this process allowed us to deepen our understanding of the emotional and mental toll that women from broad spectrum of backgrounds were braving during the pandemic, and simultaneously whether these realities were being captured by the media. So that's it, Amitsa, from my side.
All right. We'd like to welcome Nupur Basu. After a long and very arduous journey, she's joined us. Welcome, Nupur.
Hi,
Hello, I'm
Nupur.
sorry. Hi, hello. I'm so
Oh,
sorry.
that was a struggle indeed.
Yeah.
I am trying to chase Cosette actually, because we've done so much with Cosette, and so I'm just going to chase Cosette. But in the meanwhile, I wanted to start off from Bangladesh. If Afroja is here.
Yes, I'm here.
Afroja, you
Can you
are.
hear me?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Afroja, you've just released a book. Your book is now. We're looking forward to reading the book as well. In terms of
I can't hear you properly. I can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
Oh, now I can hear you.
All right. Is it better?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so Afroja, you are publishing a book around a lot of things that have gone on during the pandemic. So would you like to start from that and talk about how women in Bangladesh have been silenced?
And I think
All right.
Yeah, panelist says 10 minutes. So yeah, we'll stick to that. Yeah, Froja, please go
Oh,
ahead.
all right. Yes, that's what I was thinking about. Yes, but first of all, thank you so very much, Tasnim ji, for making me a part of this great initiative. And I'm so very, very happy to see you all, the Kushanti. Though Kosit is not here, but our communication is renewed. And I was waiting for Nupurdi, and lastly, I have heard her voice. So Nupurdi, I'm very happy to see you today. And once again, thank you so very much. If I could have managed, I mean, as we have time limitations, so I'm not going to talk about my book, but yes, it is here, and I'm very, very excited for this work. Maybe next time I would be sharing about my books. But today, yes, the stories that I'm going to share with you from Bangladesh perspective, it will have a reflection of my book and my works as well. So to start with, first of all, I have noted down some of the points. So rather, I would be following that, written write up and all this. So first of all, I would like to congratulate Tasnim ji and your team because you have accomplished a mammoth work. I must admit that. So you have examined hundreds of hours of TV contents and thousands of newspaper stories to establish a simple truth. What we, the women of Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, know by our everyday living experience that our countries and cultures are patriarchic, misogynistic, and androcentric. The system will never make us visible until we are undeniable like hills, and the system will never pay attention to the murmur unless it turns into a big loud shout that could break the ceiling of the sky. So the report that came out from Pakistan reveals a grim truth in South Asian culture have been living through. So Pakistan makes women invisible from its face as a part of its nationalist project. That's what I have learned from your report. So the question is, how far are we? Where does Bangladesh stand? So, well, I hope you all know that pre-COVID-19, Bangladesh had made significant progress on gender equality in several areas. I mean, we as a country, Bangladesh has been ranked the top country among its South Asian neighbors by performing the best in narrowing the gender gap. Bangladesh closed 72.6 of its overall gender gap and obtained 50th position out of 153 countries globally, the World Economic Forum said in its report titled Global Gender Gap Report 2020. So, to be very honest, this pandemic has taught us that the progress that we have made is at risk. A couple of studies done by different organizations revealed gender-based violence is intensified, women's physical and mental health are ignored, women are struggling with increased domestic works like cooking, cleaning, taking care of children and adults across the country. But most of them have no place to escape and no opportunity to release their stress, but to live with. Now, indulge me to share two stories from my country. And to start with, I would pick Tahmina. Tamina Akhtar was killed by her husband on Facebook Live last April during the first phase of lockdown. The incident took place in Feni, a district situated in the southeastern part of the country. Her husband, Obaidul Haq Tutul, streamed the killing on Facebook Live before he himself turned into law enforcement. According to police, the incident happened as an aftermath of a family feud. The killing video went viral with the speed of light. At a point, Facebook intervened and removed the video. With that viral video, another perspective emerged in the public discourse. Many people asked whether the man was in sound mental health or not. So this question raised another question in my mind. So I wrote an article which is in my book, but I'm not going to discuss about that. Rather, their question was something like that, as if all the gender-based violence, I mean, all the domestic violence, physical tortures, and killings that took place in the last 50 years in our country, were done by people with unsound minds. Do you know why did people raise this question? Because this man did it in front of a camera and live, while others keep the story confined indoor walls. Wife beating is kind of normalized and accepted in our country, encouraged as well. We have dozens of clovers where you could find that wife beating is encouraged and accepted. So the couple, coming back to that couple, the couple Tahmina and Chutul were married for 5 years. The Dhaka Tribune report says that they often had arguments over financial matters. And Chutul, who worked for a Dhaka-based private firm, had borrowed money from his in-laws, but demanded even more. So now, do you see the key reason for the atrocity? COVID-19 didn't trigger it. Rather, the existing madness they were going through in their relationship, it was intensified and unleashed with full force by the pandemic and lockdown. So, as you know, women are the worst victims of any war or natural calamity. So, the same thing has been happening here now during the pandemic all over the country, regardless of educational background, class, and religion. So, now let us move to the other story. This story was published in a Bengali newspaper named Kalir Kontro back in April 2020. The story triggered such a pain in me. Actually, I am not able to put uh, this feeling in words. She was a 10-year-old girl. We both have the same first name, Afroza. Her father was a poor laborer who used to work in a handloom factory in Sirajganj, a district located in the north central area. During the lockdown, Afroza's father had no work. They survived less than a week on their savings. And then the perilous days began. The man failed to get any relief. Her wife borrowed, rice from neighbors, but at a point, um, uh, even managing one meal in a day was nearly impossible. So her mother starved most of the time to save some food for her. But after starving more than a day, she was begging her father for food. The helpless, starving father at a point snubbed the hungry little girl with harsh words. After the incident, the little girl, Afroza, took her own life on the very same day. So the pandemic is taking tools economically, physically, mentally, um, and whatnot. The entire world gave a pause to everything. Even the war between fighting countries agreed to a ceasefire. But gender-based violence was not paused for a second. Rather, it is intensified. Individual researchers showed that in times of COVID-19 crisis, domestic and sexual violence, suicide, anxiety, mental disorders, depressive disorders are already increasing in Bangladesh. Break. One of the biggest NGOs in Bangladesh, in one of its own recent research, has found 24% rise in incidents of gender-based violence. Another recent survey conducted by Manusher Jonno Foundation, a human rights organization, found among 38,125 women in 53 out of 64 districts in Bangladesh, 4,622 women were mentally tortured. 1,839 women were physically abused, and 203 were sexually abused. Another report, and this report was conducted by Ain O Shalish Kendra, another NGO. Uh, this report is telling us that COVID-19 situation, actually from January to September 2020, 397 women were died because of domestic and sexual violence, and only 208 cases were filed. At least 975 women were raped, while 204 women were made victims of rape attempts, and death after rape, 43 women. 12 women were committed suicide after rape. Among them, 762 women were raped by single accused, while 208 suffered gang rape. A recent report released by BREC found that child marriage is on the rise. One of the UN Women's recent studies also found that women are overburdened with domestic work and chores and devastated by physical and mental stress. But the question is, do we see the reflection of this reality in the Bangladeshi media? Well, the answer is both yes and no, because degree varies. Social media users in Bangladesh have a very strong voice nowadays. They even could influence the newsmakers' mind, because we have experience in several incidents. Sensational cases like Tahmina's killing, certainly this incident will be published in every newspapers, and any case like this will find its place in 9 p.m. news as well. But to be counted as publishable or to be placed in 9 p.m. news, uh, it has to be something big. No ordinary story or no ordinary women would find that. You remember I mentioned the murmur will not be heard. You have to shout out loud. Bangladeshi media is now more aware of rape and domestic violence stories, but still miles to go before saying that it is gender sensitive. I think we need to conduct similar research like you, Tasnim ji. Only then we could come up with specific data and percentage and number to claim how this society is ignoring the crime against women by omitting the news from the news media. So with this, once again, I would like to thank you all, UKs, um, Tasnim ji, and all others who are involved with this mammoth work. Um, and once again, to Shanti, Koset, though you were not, I don't know whether you were able to join here or not, Nupurdi, I'm very happy to see you all.
Cosette is there.
Looking
Cosette is here.
meeting again. Thank you so very much. Stay blessed.
Afroja, Cosette is here.
Good to know that. Good to know that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am very heartened by the fact that the Bangladeshi youth has taken it upon itself to do the bidding for a just world, I think. I would actually like to move to Dil if she is around. Dilrukshi.
Hi.
Hi, how are you? Hi, Dil. I believe there's a lot happening in Sri Lanka as well that you wanted to talk about in terms of gender and in terms of visibility of gender and gender-centered concerns.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity, and it's great to be here. I think there's so much that we can talk about, but now that we understand what the research was about, and Afroja has already walked us through much of the crisis that we seem to be regionally feeling. I just thought maybe I would speak on two aspects. One is about the impact on COVID-19's impact itself on women, because it's a case of stories we didn't tell. Mostly it's about stories that we probably did not tell, but the stories that were actually happening, incidents that were actually happening. And on the other hand, the negative contribution of the media itself. And in Sri Lanka, there is a huge discussion about how the media portrayed um persons with COVID-19, in particular persons of particular communities, and then again women as well. So these are the two broad areas I want to touch upon. Um, because Afroja also referred to the gender gap index, I think it's a good, point of departure. If we were to look at Sri Lanka, well, we are placed 102nd. That's the slot. But when you look at the formula, how you get assessed as a country, health and survival is also a key aspect. So health and survival is what I would like to focus on. And so what was the gendered health impact on women who were exposed to the pandemic? And did we ever analyze that in the storytelling that we did? I think not. There were desperate little attempts to, do that, but there isn't certainly any quantitative or qualitative study like the one that we listened to, and the presentation that we just had. There was no such thing, but analytics do show that women's exposure levels were like, around 32 to 35% if you compared with men. Of course, this is depending on the women's exposure. Um, the question would be, did this story come out? Did women get less exposure? Did women get access to the kind of healthcare and the special requirements they may have? They definitely had when they went into quarantine. I remember looking at stories where stories about sanitation requirements of women who were being, pushed into quarantine was discussed, but it was never really enough, and it was not a reflection of what was happening in Sri Lanka. A strict lockdown also means, in a lockdown situation, abusive partners can actually, upscale the violence. So domestic violence, I think it's something that South Asia definitely has in huge measure. So domestic violence emerged as a huge concern, and here is something that got reported on. Sri Lanka did report on it. I would say certainly not adequately. That's because civil society groups made sure, women made sure that certain concerned women and women's groups drew the public's attention to the increasing violence against women in a strict lockdown situation, and subsequently so. So violent partners, and while you have violent partners, you also have lack of access to redressal mechanisms. And you go beyond that, what about legal and medical redress, psychosocial impact that you have to deal with? And then also the interim support that women should have had. Did we ever talk about these stories? Yes, we did, but occasionally, so not enough. And did we talk about the provisions that we have in the Prevention of Domestic Violence Act, and how we may use that in lockdowns and in restricted movement situations like what we all experience? What kind of interim support that women would have and should have had? These are the stories that we didn't tell. And I think there were so many stories we could have said, and could have said more with great emphasis and with more impact. But many of the stories went missing. So just as Afro just said, so I think it's a South Asian story also, the increased burden of domestic and care work within the households. All these topics were touched upon, but not necessarily not enough. and way too random, way too infrequent, the way in which we reported on. So if you look at the national statistics, there were, interim statistics, sets of data we had to show that daily there are about 250 accidents that are recorded in Sri Lanka, the national hospital record. So, but during the lockdown, the number of accidents clearly reduced because of movement restrictions. But out of the kind of incidents that were getting, the accidents that were being reported, certainly included more women who experienced violence in the hands of their intimate partners. So that's something that got picked up. I think there should have been greater emphasis on gender-based violence during the pandemic, but this kind of reporting certainly didn't take place to the extent that it should have happened. Uh, Also, um, the second component of what I would like to talk about is the negative contribution by media. And I think the plight of women, if you were to talk about plight of women, we also have female-headed households in the country, and also a huge informal sector. So where are these stories? Where were these women? The stories certainly, if you do analyze the content, there was a lot of stigmatizing, dehumanizing, and invisibilization. So a lot of women got invisible, despite the fact that they were going through all of this. And stigmatization certainly was focused on women. Just give you two case studies. One is anyone who knows about Sri Lanka would understand that the remittance. We have a remittance economy, and women who line the Sri Lankan economy are the domestic workers or caregivers who are working in the Middle East. These people, and they are women, so they got stigmatized. They were referred to as COVID bombs by no less a person than the ministers in office. Uh, there was a migrant returnee from Kuwait, and to capital, she was also Muslim. In this country, there is a huge anti-Muslim sentiment. That we're experiencing. So she was called a COVID bomb. So all the layers of stigmatization. You're a woman, you're a migrant worker, you're a migrant attorney, and you're Muslim. So that's like multiple layers of stigmatization that went with that. So people had a different way of looking at migrant workers. There were people, there were discussions that migrant workers should not be allowed to come back. And when you talk about migrant workers, yes, we have large numbers of men as well, but women certainly make the majority in terms of numbers. And the next set of people would also be again women. These are the apparel sector workers. Who works in the apparel sector? There was an incident in one of the northeastern factories, but at a globally well-known apparel manufacturing facility, a woman tested positive COVID-19. And instead of talking about the responsibility of the workplace to ensure that the place had sufficient sanitation standards, healthcare standards, or workplace safety, none of those things were discussed. We simply ended up talking. The media, there was a huge media trial about her morals, that she had some kind of affair and she went out partying. All of that leaving huge impact and causing trauma to her as well as to her family. And that the news reporting at that time was truly sensational, very disturbing, and definitely traumatizing and stigmatizing certain sections of the society. And if we were to look at communities, how the fault lines actually play out in this, the Muslim community had it worse in Sri Lanka. They were stigmatized a lot, and at a point they were referred to as the super spreaders. So as a community, they were the super spreaders. And these are some of the observations that I would like to share right now with you all. So what was the role in contributing to nation building and the recovery plans? I'm sure there were women contributing, but there were no such stories of women's contribution to the recovery process. The scientists, the occasional story notwithstanding, there wasn't much about how women could have contributed, how they were contributing. And there was also no qualitative or quantitative analysis of the way in which we covered the COVID story and the kind of stories we failed to tell about women's experiences, the kind of gender-based violence they had to endure and they continue to endure, and the increased burdens, whether it's domestic or in terms of caregiving, and the fact that media actually failed the women in Sri Lanka mostly, because not only because they failed to tell the stories that we should have been telling, but also because we stigmatized women, we marginalized them, we also made them invisible. So it's really not a great story from Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilukshi. This is we've been separated by partition, but our the way that we approach women is just the same. 70, 80 years, whatever it is, it's just the same. It's horrible. So, okay, so in terms of the format, we had kept a few minutes for each participant to answer questions as well, if anyone wants to ask those questions. The floor is open for Dilukshi. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask her. She's done with her bit. So any questions for Dilukshi? Yes, Krishanti. Yes, Krishanti.
Thank you for a very comprehensive picture of Sri Lanka, which I think is kind of pretty much every country right now when we speak about it. Can you speak to the domestic workers? Because it's not the migrant workers, they're also, the remittance is very important, but the economy of Sri Lanka relies on them, right? So if they were not earning and they were not remitting money, then that would directly impact the economy of Sri Lanka. So was there any recognition of that?
That's well, that's a $1 million question. That used to be the most recognized thing about the migrant workers before, but COVID clearly made a huge shift, and we clearly forgot about it. Our stories did not reflect the fact that, except for the the few people who would analyze their contribution to the Sri Lankan economy, which is very little in terms of the kind of stories that were coming out. But most of the stories were about please don't send them, the whole fear psychosis that was driven by not understanding what it is like to face a pandemic and deal with it. We understand the trauma that people undergo, but then you also need to prioritize and show that they also have a right to return to their homeland. This is their country. They have every right to come and seek refuge, particularly in a health crisis like that. But this right, one of the most hurtful things I observed, Krishanti, was the fact that we forgot to recognize that they were Sri Lankans and they had every right to return home. So this was not recognized. Second thing, their economic contribution to the Sri Lankan economy, that too was not very important because people just saw them as COVID bombs. What can we say when people in office, from the military to military top boss to the government ministers, end up saying that that the whole thing gets framed in that way, that you don't have to recognize that. But of course, there are if you look at the media coverage, there will be people who would report about the drop in the remittances and the fact that this is going to really impact the Sri Lankan economy. Yes, we do talk about it when you analyze the economy and the number game. But beyond that, no, that was very disturbing. The fact that we failed to recognize who was lining the Sri Lankan economy, and the second being the apparel sector workers.
Anyone else? Okay, Dilukshi, I had one question as well. In terms of how religion is kind of operating in Sri Lanka, I'm kind of wondering, we generally look at examples like Nepal and Sri Lanka sitting in Pakistan, thinking that these are the models that we need to follow. From what you are saying, it's not that way. I mean, the argument out here is that women have lots of agency in Nepal, lots of agency in Sri Lanka to do what they have, or to do what they want to do, to be who they are. And that is underpinned by a demographic which is young, which wants to change how things are done, which wants to build their countries in very different ways. So are you basically saying that that's not entirely true? And because one thing that I've kind of learned is that among the youth, the young demographic as well, we see a certain doubling down on old values, on old patriarchal values. We see that as well, right? And particularly among men. I recognize that as well. This creates a problem going forward, don't you think?
It does, and the nation state, and in South Asia, the nation state is such an important thing, and then they seem to determine so many things, and that also how we treat and look at women is one of those. And in that, you asked a very interesting question about what role religion plays, and whether it is about religion or the culture that is introduced by religion or perpetuated by the religious hierarchy, the established religion, is an interesting question. I think we all should answer to. The fact that in Sri Lanka we have had 30 years of war, and conflict seems to be it's second nature to us, and we have always gone from one conflict to the other. And right now there is significant friction between the majority Sinhala Buddhists and the minority Muslims. And the Easter Sunday attacks, the bombings have certainly contributed to that. And the radicalization that is taking place has certainly contributed to that. But with all of that, there is, if you ask me one question about who feels most insecure in this country, I think the Muslims in this country must be feeling absolutely insecure at this moment, because the stigmatization, the ways in which you get stigmatized is very, it's scary to look at. The way in which that they feel disenfranchised is something that I often get to hear about. So on the other hand, the role of the young people. So as much as they contribute to this discourse, I think that we also need to talk a little bit about the disinformation, misinformation, and the propaganda, because that's probably where the young people come in and play a significantly important and relevant, vital role. Because their understanding of technology and the use of it is different, unlike the way in which you challenge all values that maybe belong to a different generation, they discuss these issues within the parameters of disinformation, and they do not necessarily speak always through the lens of gender or about equality, but they definitely approach it through the lens of disinformation and see that there is disinformation that targets communities, identifies and victimizes people and makes them invisible. And women are certainly one of those key groups that get invisibilized and marginalized in the media space and through the political mechanism. So I think everything isn't lost for all that's said here. And young people do have a different approach, and I do find that there is most of the time there is less focus on gender, but there is greater focus on how technology can be used to deal with disinformation and misinformation. And this is something I found very interesting, that they looked at the stories that I mentioned about the women, the migrant women, and also apparel sector workers. They approached it through the lens of disinformation and the fact that you needed to debunk it, because that's a different approach, but it's very welcome. I would say that's a very interesting way in which the young people approach that issue.
The young energy, it's good. It's good in South Asia. Thank you so much, Elrukshi. I also wanted to ask if anyone had questions for Afroja. I'm very sorry I forgot that. But does anyone have any questions for Afroja? Okay, it doesn't seem like anyone has questions for Afroja, but I'm going to stick to Bangladesh actually. And one of the people that I've looked up to and one of my heroes in life is actually here, Shiri Haq. So Shiri has been unwell, but has been very gracious to give us a lot of time for this event. Welcome, Shiri.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Um, First, I do apologize for not being well and therefore not having read through the report from Pakistan. I don't even know if you sent it, but because I've not been checking my mails. Um, I just wanted to start by saying that Naripakho um, has been concerned with and continues to be concerned with violence against women and girls, COVID or no COVID. Our concern and our interventions continue through this period, although, of course, some of our interventions have been affected by the COVID restrictions. For example, the work we were doing with Rohingya women in the camps has had to stop because permission to go into the camps has been the restrictions have become much tighter, and unless you are actually providing service delivery, you are not given permission. So the work we were doing with the Rohingya women who were survivors of violence from their own, particularly from the military in Myanmar, that has had to stop, which is quite unfortunate. We have ourselves not done any research on how the media has or has not visibilized uh, violence against women or women per se during this period. But as Afroza has already mentioned, that the BRAC Institute of Gender and Development, BIGD, has done extensive research, and she has referred to those findings, and so has Manucha Junno Foundation, not so extensive, but they have done a telephone survey, the results of which were presented in a press conference. She has referred to that also, so I will not go into that. But I think from our own impressions and from the networks that we work with, what comes through is that there are serious challenges in reporting, which has arisen at this time. So, reporting has always been a problem because of the social um, stigma around uh, violence against women, particularly around sexual violence and around domestic violence, that it has always been, and there has always been an underreporting. And now the challenges have increased with the restrictions around isolation, the need for isolation, etc. So that has become a new, I think, challenge for us to come up with ideas, for the women's movement particularly to come up with uh, with, with a positive proposal or a response mechanism. So the usual response mechanisms are not working as well. I think that is one of the findings that we have through our networks. The other one is that in the media, especially in the mainstream media, the mainstream media continues to have difficulty in making the connection between the everyday discrimination against women and girls and the fact that that underwrites in some ways the violence that erupts. The violence is much more visible than the discrimination. And that too, grievous violence is more visible than, let's say, not so grievous violence. And so the media has these blind spots, which, despite a lot of work, a lot of training, etc., awareness raising, it seems that we have not really broken through. So mainstream media continues to have these blind spots. So you have to be beaten to death or at least, a few broken limbs before the media will take note of it. So this is one problem. But the other is that there is no attempt to link this tendency for violence, whether it is during COVID times or outside of COVID times, and whether it has increased during COVID times or has not increased, irrespective of that, is the culture of misogyny. That there is essentially a culture where women are despised, or women are looked down upon, or women are looked as inferior beings, and that has something to do with the violence that takes place, whether it is in a conjugal relationship or outside in the streets. I think listening to Dilrukshi, I was also thinking about our own remittance uh, warriors, if you want to put it that way. In fact, in Bangla, we say remittance Jodha. And that term came about in order to counter extremely derogatory comments by ministers, by cabinet members about um, our workers, our migrant workers. That is a complete denial how important that remittance is in our economy. And I'm not talking about only the women migrant workers, I'm talking about all migrant workers. There is a tendency to completely deny the importance of that remittance in our economy. But one of the things that has happened is there were serious suggestions, serious proposals by civil society actors that Bangladesh government should be spending or sending rather relief for people in Italy or in Spain or in in countries where they were left high and dry without any work, without any kind of social support, without any kind of um, relief packages, etc. And this was met with laughter. You know, they thought it was a joke because they have always sent money to Bangladesh. Now, the very suggestion that Bangladesh should be sending any kind of support was a joke. They thought it was a joke. So that is how much we actually value our workers, and it really showed up how pathetic uh, our attitude and our views are about our workers. I will not go into more of that. I think Dilrukshi talked about it in detail, and it's very similar. Although I think in Sri Lanka it is not as bad. There is more recognition than in Bangladesh. Um, the only times women do make the news is unfortunate. Most recently, um, that there have been a high number of deaths of medical doctors during this COVID period, and because they were on the front line. And in fact, um, the number of deaths of doctors is alarming, and there needs to be some kind of inquiry or audit as to why so many doctors had to die. Um, but anyway, when you look at the numbers, it's mostly men, it's mostly male doctors, very few women doctors. Um, so this is, I don't know how to interpret that as of yet. I think it needs a serious audit or a serious verbal autopsy in order to interpret those figures or the difference in those figures. What is unfortunate is that 3 days ago, the news of a woman doctor became viral for the wrong reasons. She was, we right now we have a total lockdown, which means you either have to have a movement pass or your identity card, which shows that you are an essential worker, which includes doctors and health workers. So she was wearing a medical apron, and she felt that the police did not have a right to stop her and ask for her identity card. And so she became very angry, and there was a magistrate in that team who also then tried very politely to ask for her identity card. She refused to show her identity card. She said that the fact that she was wearing a medical apron was enough, and the fact that the car she was traveling in had some kind of sticker of the medical institution should be enough. So it's very unfortunate that women make the news for the wrong reasons. but this has become very viral, and there's a huge debate going on in social media about whether she's right or whether the police are right, etc. So this is the situation in Bangladesh. But what I want to come back to is that no matter COVID or no COVID, the culture of misogyny rules okay. There has been very little dent to that. And the fact that discrimination continues, these are two reasons why violence will continue and why the response mechanisms that have been set up for violence continue not to work as well. And at this time, during COVID time, the challenges to reporting has really gone up. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiri. I'm sure there are lots of questions for you. Who wants to start? No. Well, all right. Okay, so I had a few questions. No, I had a few questions actually. I'm so excited about it. So in Pakistan, we've been seeing a certain rollback of all of these things that, feminists had fought for 2 or 3 decades, for over 2 or 3 decades. Is that the same process that is happening in Bangladesh? Or is the demographic pressure enough to kind of push the authoritarianism, the cultural authoritarianism away?
I think we are facing the worst period of authoritarian rule since independence. And we have what is called a Digital Security Act, by which any criticism of the government and of the ruling family can land you in jail for 7 years. So this is a period of extreme repression, extreme political repression, and the opposition, I believe, more than 2,000 opposition activists are in prison. Other than the political opposition, writers, cartoonists, journalists have all been, have all suffered under this act. So there is a demand right now for a total, what is the word for it? That this act should be abolished altogether. Some people are saying, no, we need the act, we need digital security, but we need to get rid of some of the articles in the act, some of the parts of the act. So what we need is a reform of the act. So either way, the act is under a lot of criticism by civil society activists. And so this is a bad time. This is a bad time in Bangladesh.
Recently in Pakistan, so Pakistan every year has